Ashley Banfield, Julie Grant, and Ted Rowlands set to go this evening. Our first story, big breaking news today. It's a case that is more than 20 years old. Kristin Smart, college student, goes missing. Nothing for over 20 years, but tonight, a big break in the case. Ted Rowlands has the latest.
Kristin Smart was a 19-year-old college freshman at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo when she vanished in May of 1996. Last seen leaving a party with two other students, Kristin's disappearance has remained a mystery for nearly 24 years. Now many believe an arrest may be coming soon. Search warrants were executed in February at the Los Angeles County home of Paul Flores, one of the students Kristin was last seen with. His parents' home in Aurora Grande, California, and property in Washington State were also searched. Then, on Wednesday, police returned to search Paul's home again. A statement released by the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office reads in part that investigators were looking for, quote, specific items of evidence. Kristin was pronounced legally dead in 2002, but this billboard with Kristin's face has remained a fixture on the California's Central Coast since her disappearance, serving as a daily reminder of unserved justice.
The distance between the last place she was seen alive and the door to her dorm building at Muir Hall is just about 40 yards.
That's the voice of Chris Lambert on his podcast, Your Own Backyard. It's a deep dive into Kristin's disappearance. The podcast has renewed interest in the case and is putting pressure on authorities to solve it. Lambert tells Court TV he believes Flores is likely responsible for Kristin's death.
On the walk back to her dorm, I think that Paul Flores took her instead to either his dorm or another location, attempted to sexually assault her, and I think that she lost her life in the process.
Paul Flores, the defendant in Smart versus Flores, San Luis Obispo Superior Court case.
Paul Flores, who's been the main suspect from the beginning, maintains his innocence. For years, the Smart family was frustrated with the local sheriff's department, but since current sheriff Ian Parkinson took over, things have changed.
Ian Parkinson, it's been different. He keeps a close line of communication with the family. They have a lot more faith in him, and he's promised that he's going to bring this to a close.
Besides the podcast and the new sheriff, there's also an army of Facebook supporters keeping Kristin's story alive, and news of this week's search warrants has people buzzing with anticipation.
I think the best thing that we can do for Kristin and her family right now is what Kristin supporters like doing the very least, but have gotten really, really good at, is just being patient and waiting.
I absolutely believe this is going to get solved. I think we've got so many eyes on this case now that the pressure to solve this soon is higher than it's ever been.
It's amazing what public pressure can do. And you're talking about more than 20 years ago. Let's bring everybody back in. Ted, this is an amazing development. A couple words jumped out, though, in your piece there. Specific items of evidence. What are these specific items of evidence? Any idea tonight?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in February they searched the 3 different properties, and you could think, well, maybe they were in one of the properties, at least the one on the Central Coast where his parents lived, maybe they were looking for her body, going to go dig and look there. But why did they come back to Paul Flores' home in Southern California this week looking for something specific? What could it be? I mean, he hasn't lived there. I mean, he moved there many years ago, but it was many years after Kristin disappeared. It wouldn't be her body. Very interesting. I can't wait to find out what it is they were after. Of course, all of those documents and those search warrants are sealed, so we just don't know.
Ashley, it just seems like the momentum is building at this point. I think everyone is right that there's going to be an arrest at some point here.
One word, 2 syllables, podcast. I think this is kind of a new thing in our lives, Vinny. But if you think back to 2014 and the Adnan Syed podcast that just blew open a case and actually ended up reigniting litigation that went all the way to the Supreme Court, this is a similar kind of story. A podcast was what got people re-energized and ultimately led to a furtherance of the investigation. And then to that little green tent that you saw on that lawn. And I think that little green tent speaks volumes, because oftentimes investigators don't bring out a tent unless they're doing something like digging.
Yeah, I am amazed here, Julie, that this many years later we're looking for something very, very specific that might still actually exist.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Vinny. That's the one thing I was thinking about when we learned about the seizure of those vehicles and what could possibly be in them after all these years that could possibly be the break in the case. And, at Court TV, we always try to root things in the law any chance we get. And that search warrant had to say, it had to be specific. I mean, the Fourth Amendment calls for that. Warrants have to be specific about the places to be searched, the items or persons to be seized. So that warrant wouldn't have gotten approved by the judge unless it had specificity. So that is the burning question, as Ted said. Don't we want to know what, if anything, turned up, if they were able to recover those items that they were seeking? And certainly this family deserves closure. I know we're all in agreement on that. They've been so patient, and the heartbreak they've endured, and they deserve some answers. And hopefully with all the patience throughout these past 24 years, this is going to come to a head and they'll get those answers finally.
Ted, what's Paul Flores' story? Who is this guy?
Well, he was a student at San Luis Obispo at Cal Poly at the same time Kristin was. He was known as kind of a loner and someone who would show up at parties and would go, basically annoy women. And at this party, according to witnesses, Kristin was drunk. And she left the party drunk with someone she didn't know, another girl, and Paul Flores. They walked home towards the dorms, and the girl told police that was with Kristin and Paul that Paul said, "I'll take her the rest of the way. Don't worry about it. I got this." And that girl, who I'm sure to this day feels horrible about it, said, "Okay, go ahead." And that was the last anybody saw of Kristin. I also want to make a point, Vinny, on the podcast. The podcast absolutely blew this thing up. Two other things, though, are part of this. A new sheriff took over the investigation who pledged that he was going to look at it, and the billboard. The billboard has been up for 20 plus years on the Central Coast. And the reason this podcast was ever made was because Chris Lambert grew up there and drove by that thing all the time. And one day he said, "Who is this Kristin Smart?" Looked into it, and boom, that's what ignited that young man to create, who is a musician, this podcast.
Ashley, to me, it's very frustrating because the obvious first person you're going to look at seems to be the person they're looking at now 20 years later. I mean, it's almost as if investigators didn't do their job initially. And I don't understand that. That is utterly frustrating because if he ends up being arrested, it's the obvious person to arrest and investigate.
You would think, right? It's always the last person seen with the victim or the person who's disappeared. But listen, a lot of these investigative techniques have changed over the years, right? She's been gone for 24 years. Things have changed. I will say this, though. The fact that we have never found Kristin, we don't have a body. If anybody who's watching right now is worried that that's going to hamper the prosecution, well, sit right back and relax, because we've covered lots of cases without bodies. And actually, Vinny, I was digging a little today, and I found something absolutely fascinating. A cold case from Michigan, 37 years old. The victim, Richard Atwood, disappeared in 1983. He was last seen with a guy named Roy Snell. Roy's now 55. And guess what just happened to Roy last month? He was arrested. He was arrested for the murder of Richard Atwood. And they never found Richard Atwood's body. But 37 years later, they were able to cull enough evidence to make that arrest. So for the smarts, if they're watching, relax and rest assured that the law can actually work miracles decades later, as can investigators.
Absolutely. Julie, as you look at this, now, again, I come back to this fact. This is the obvious person who should be investigated. At what point do prosecutors or investigators, and the combination of the two, say, well, we're just not going to, we're not going to arrest anyone. It's been 20 years of this. 20 years of, we don't have enough evidence. And they've been looking in the same place now for 20 years, and we're back there.
I hear what you're saying, Vinny. I know it's clear that they have been trying. I was pretty impressed when I saw in just some of the research we were doing today that since 2011, they've searched 9 different locations, 18 different search warrants, resubmitted 37 different pieces of evidence from the early stages of the investigation, because now, as Ashley mentioned, we have new technology, right, and can do different DNA testing than we could so many years back. And to Ashley's point, think about the GPS and other things they weren't able to do then that they could possibly do now. So certainly, I think they've been looking at this guy since day one. He's just being called a person of interest. And I think if they had the evidence, they would have charged him. And they're on it. I think one thing that jumps out at me, though, is his lack of cooperation. From what I understand in reading some of the local reporting that was done on this, he refused to cooperate when he was initially interviewed. He refused to cooperate in a deposition. It's my understanding refused to cooperate when some evidence was presented to a grand jury. So his silence, I think, is saying something here. And I don't know what. We don't know enough about this case, but I would just say pay attention to what he's not doing.
Mm-hmm. And Vinny, I tell you, they did drop the ball. Investigators dropped the ball. She went missing on a holiday weekend. She was last seen drunk. So back then, the girl was drunk, college girl. They didn't interview Flores for days. He had ample opportunity. Even though her friends were worried, her family was worried, they dropped the ball out of the gate, and they'll admit it. Even now they will. They'll say that investigation was botched, and they paid 20 plus years because of it.
Sad.
Unbelievable. All right.
Terrible.
Thanks so much, everyone. We got a lot more to cover tonight. 3 hours every night, folks.